and a very, very warm welcome to day 3 of the second International Agrobiodiversity Congress, Eat, Grow, Save. I'm Chris Kettle, Principal Scientist and Global Lead on Tree Biodiversity for Resilient Landscapes at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIET, and a Group Leader at ETH Zurich. It has been an honour and a privilege to be the Day Chair for Day 3 on production, appropriately sandwiched in between consumption, eat, and conservation, save. We all know that production systems not only drive what we eat, but are also the single largest driver of biodiversity loss and contribute approximately 1/4 of emissions causing the climate crisis. This is why I'm so excited to have chaired this day, exploring how we can transition food production systems to more sustainable, more biodiverse, and resilient systems that nourish people and the planet. We have a really packed day of amazing sessions, starting next with an inspiring Eat, Grow, Save talk from Raj Patel, award-winning author of Stuffed to Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System, and the filmmaker of The Ants and the Grasshopper, as well as a research professor from University of Texas. Don't forget to put questions to Raj in the Wova chat. This will be followed by 2 scientific roundtable sessions. The first session, chaired by Tom Wagner, focuses on transformational change in the food production system and nature-positive solutions, with 5 scientific abstracts presented, followed by a Q&A session. We are honoured to have a diverse panel of experts zooming in from around the globe to discuss how we can leverage scientific innovations to transform food production systems. After a short video interlude coming from the Amazonian Peru, we will start session 2, chaired by Bea Mas and co-moderated by my colleague Rina Janelin, focusing on how we can enhance diversity on farm for climate resilience and to enhance ecosystem service delivery and maintain production, with a further 6 abstract presenters and 4 amazing expert panelists. This will be followed by an exploration of neglected and underutilized species, the foods of tomorrow, from the perspective of indigenous people, chaired by Ivan Novotny from ETH Zurich, and guest speakers will come from India, the Solomon Islands, Mexico, Ethiopia, and North America. From 2 p.m. Rome time, we will start the Policy and Business Forum, chaired by Tiffany Talisman, with keynote addresses from Louise Baker, Managing Director of the Global Mechanism of the UN CCD, and Irene Hoffman from the Commission on Genetic Resources from the Food and Agriculture Organization. Tiffany will moderate the discussion, including perspectives from the diverse actors in the private sector, international organizations, and NGO sector to explore how policy can be better leveraged to encourage the private sector to transition to more sustainable production, and the role of science and collaboration between research institutions and the business sector to help transform global food systems. We'll close with some brief words of reflection from all of the production day chairs, my colleagues and I'm especially excited that we will also hear from the author of Eating to Extinction and broadcaster Dan Saladino on his take-homes from the day. Please remember to use the Wova chat function to ask your questions and to interact with other attendees of this amazing Congress. I'm really excited to learn and explore together with you what we can all do to help the transformational change we so need in food production systems. And I wish you all a productive, inspiring, and energizing 3rd day of the International Agrobiodiversity Congress. Thanks for participating and keep active in the chat.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm embarrassed that I'm attending a conference on agrobiodiversity, and I join you today with pathetically little knowledge about it. But what I do understand, and what I hope we'll be able to talk about a little bit, is the context in which agrobiodiversity needs to thrive. And so today's talk is something that takes that right on. So let's begin. We're now in the world where the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has this wonderful 10 elements of agroecology for us to be able to draw on. The problem here is, well, first of all, it looks like this. And if you're trying to engage with an audience of policymakers, they'll see this diagram and run a mile. And that's unfortunate because, yes, agroecology is complicated. Yes, it's much more than just farming with biodiversity added. But it's important to understand that agroecology is an intervention in a range of spaces. We understand that agroecology is a science, it's a set of practices, and it is a movement. And when you explain agroecology this way, people may scratch their heads and say, well, why can't it just be one of those things? Why isn't agroecology just what we do when we get together and come to an agrobiodiversity conference? And the reason that we need to take the step back and we need to contextualize is because the context in which agroecology can become a movement that can allow us to live on this planet in a way that everyone eats well. In order for that to happen, we need to recognize the constraints under which we operate. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. And to do that, I want to really sort of zoom in on the current configurations of power, the matrix in which the ideas of agroecology need to be presented. We need to think about the arenas in which we're fighting for a world in which there is more agrobiodiversity. So to do that, I just wanted to use an image that some of my colleagues in the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems put together in 2016. Now, this is the 8 lock-ins of the current food system. You'll see right at the center is the concentration of corporate power. Thinking about power in the food system, one doesn't merely need to observe that it's a long story. A century ago, there were 4 major grain trading operations: Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. And they're still around today. But what's worrying is that increasingly we're seeing the rise of concentrated corporate power and the rise of concentrated political power to back it up. Particularly through the recessions that we've seen, what we've seen in these recessions, including the one that we're in at the moment, is a movement towards increased corporate monopoly over the food system, so that in every major sector of the food system, we're seeing now a concentration ratio going up and up, in which more than 50% of the food system is controlled by really just a handful of corporations, particularly when looking at international trade. So why is this allowed to happen? Well, it's allowed to happen because we're told that we must expect cheap food, and corporations are good at doing that, much better at doing that than our little organic farms that demand labor and regenerative practices. Cheap food is really what corporate power in the food system has conditioned us to expect. And that means that we're buying into certain narratives about how food is produced. And these corporations are not represented then as villains, and the departments of agriculture that support them are not the bad guys. They're the ones who are feeding the world. And that's interesting because in order for that to be believable, we have to compartmentalize the thinking around how food is produced. So yes, there may be cheap food in abundance from certain kinds of farming systems and certain kinds of farming technology, but we must at the same time forget that we are on the brink of the 6th extinction, that a great deal of industrial agricultural practices involves deforestation, involves species loss, involves the release of carbon into the atmosphere. But of course, the enemy of this of joined up thinking is urgency. If we're worried about making sure that we're feeding the world tomorrow, if we're making sure that we're replacing this failing agrochemical with one that's slightly better, then we must proceed quarter to quarter rather than thinking in the long term about the future of the planet. And that's because the way that we quantify, the way that we measure our success is often down to brute and simple indicators like yield or like profit or like returns to individual sectors of farming, rather than thinking again in a joined up way about, are we successfully battling hunger? If we only have yield as an indication, then it may be that transformations in India around about the late 1960s can be heralded as a success. And we see the doubling of grain yields for certain kinds of grain. But if we're interested in the abolition of hunger, then the fact that India is, 122 out of 130 in the global hunger index today suggests that the Green Revolution really hasn't done a whole lot in its stated aim of ending hunger. But of course, that's because we're sort of caught in a world where the goal of agriculture, increasingly, particularly in the global south, is to pay off debt, to pay off the path dependency in which loans often incurred illegitimately now need to be paid off with the export of certain kinds of tropical products and commodities that might be sold in order to return to the treasury a certain kind of dollar value. So all of this is to say, look, we're in a world where, yes, if we're interested in agroecology, we need to be aware of its synergies. But, industrial agriculture operates in this space and operates within the matrix in which agroecology is attempting to insert itself. And so, if we're interested in synergies, here's a picture of synergies. You've got your combine harvester and your tractor trailer synergistically working side by side. If we're interested in understandings of synergies that break from this, then we are going to have to confront the reality of industrial agriculture across the many terrains in which it operates, and not merely at the terrain of biology. So let's if synergies are at the heart of agroecology, what else does agroecology encourage us to think about? Well, of course, it's diversity is a fairly central idea to agroecology. So let's think about that for a second. We've got our sort of standard idea. If you want a poster child for, biodiversity working together, then the milpa system, the Mesoamerican, crop system in which you've got corn and beans and squash working together, is fabulous. And here we get to geek out, looking at the different kinds of roots and the root depth, that allows, this, polyculture to generate much more food per unit area than any monoculture can. It's very exciting. It's an example of biodiversity at work. And it is the diversity of crops working together that gives us the sort of happy ending. If we're saying, well, agroecology has, diversity, industrial agriculture has its diversities too, and we need to confront them and confront the short-term thinking that they are a part of. Another thing that agroecology purports to offer is resilience, and we know again, the data suggests that if we are to weather the more and more extreme weather events, greater levels of biodiversity are associated with a more resilient ecosystem and a more productive one. But just knowing this is not enough to make it true. And it's not as if advocates of agroecology have a monopoly on thinking in the medium to long term and have a monopoly on thinking about resilience. Even McKinsey thinks about resilience. We're in the middle of the whiplash of supply chains, across the planet as a result of COVID, but also as a result of having very short, just-in-term supply chains that were structurally always going to do this. We can see that there are, weaknesses in these supply chains. McKinsey can see that there are weaknesses in the supply chains. Just knowing that such a thing is possible doesn't mean that it's going to stop it from happening. And McKinsey and a range of consultancy firms are able to be able to project in the short, medium, and long term what might happen if we have less resilient supply chains, and they're able to talk about resiliency while operating within the paradigm that they have created. So we really do need to be thinking beyond the paradigm that we're in at the moment. But of course, we're being offered, different kinds of approaches to think about food systems. I mean, one of the things about agroecology is that it leans into, the rich traditions of human gastronomy, the spread of these kinds of gastronomy, the spread of what appears to be consumer choice, but in fact involves the destruction of certain kinds of human knowledge, are integral to the sort of march of industrial agriculture. Resisting that is going to involve political challenges. And that's the hard part here. Because, we can talk about recycling and efficiency. We can talk, for every sort of node here in the nexus of agroecology, we can talk about the ways in which industrial versus agroecological is a fight. But, perhaps the most difficult and awkward one is here when we're thinking about human and social values. If there is a charter for human and social values, it is this, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But even here, you can see and trace out a conflict, and a very deep one actually that goes to the heart of what it is that lies ahead of us if we are to have an empire of sprawling agrobiodiversity. Then we need to resolve this, and it's going to take politics, which is unfortunate because part of the joy of agrobiodiversity is to some extent to feel like one is spending time communing with nature and free from politics. But there's no such thing as a space free from politics, unfortunately. Look, here we are. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that there is such a thing as a right to food, clothing, housing, and medical care. But unfortunately, that is structurally at odds and in tension with Article 17. Which is that so everyone has the right to own property alone as well as an association with others. Now, the tension between food and property is one that we really do need to come to terms with here, and we need to decide which is more important. Because at the moment, the way that the global economy is structured is very much in favor of Article 17 and very much against Article 26. So more property and less food. And you can see that particularly around ideas about knowledge, right? We now have, when we're thinking about the spread of ideas around agrobiodiversity, agroecology is precisely about the generous co-creation of knowledge. Here's just a scene from a recipe day in northern Malawi. I was lucky enough to work with the Soils, Food and Healthy Communities Initiative here, where we were looking at the ways that the sharing of knowledge is not only a process of sort of generosity and helping folk understand new ways in which crops that are well suited to nutrition, higher levels of nutrition, and an era of climate change might be shared. But this is an example of how actually sharing and co-creating knowledge can be a way of addressing things like patriarchy and generating much more equal social relations than you might have otherwise. But there are other ways of sharing knowledge, and at the moment, unfortunately, they involve things like the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization can turn around and say, look, if you like sharing knowledge, come to us. We'll put a patent on it. You will make it publicly available, but you'll have a monopoly on it for a set period of time. And of course, that period of time grows longer and longer. And that's the problem here. That, again, in every arena that agroecology wants to operate, there is a way in which there are attempts to privatize it, to narrow its benefits into the hands of just a few people. There are ways in which the governance of that purports to be responsible, but in fact isn't. This is a very blurred picture, but unfortunately this is the only one I could find of the dispute settlement mechanism at the World Trade Organization. These are essentially lawyers and bureaucrats who sometimes work for corporations and sometimes work to adjudicate in their favor at the World Trade Organization. And on the other hand, you've got a group of people who are anonymous, not because they are here to take your money, but because this is a Zapatista women's organization meeting. But the idea here is that they are anonymous not because that they're seeking to hide themselves, but because the only face that matters when they confront you is you. You are sovereign over them, and that's rather different from the anonymized bureaucracies that essentially funnel public wealth into private hands at the World Trade Organization. So, as we come to the end, I just want to sort of observe that the economy in which we operate under agroecology would be a circular and solidarity economy, but we're very far from that right now. The economy in which biodiversity is being annihilated is one that's characterized by the privatization of profit and the socialization of costs. We can see this from a Rockefeller Foundation report that was released earlier on this year, where they observed that in 2019, in fact, oddly, it was McKinsey who figured this out. In 2019, Americans spent $1.1 trillion on food. It was just about the United States in 2019. But what they also figured out is that the externalities of the food system just in the United States amounted to $2.1 trillion. And the largest slice of that was in terms of the costs of human health of the existing food system. But you can see that biodiversity also has its dollar value attached, and environmental problems, and of course the underpaying of workers is a substantial problem in the externalities generated by the food system. But the food system depends on these externalities. It wouldn't be possible for the food system to exist while internalizing these social costs and internalizing these externalities. And so the social cost of food is not the $1.1 trillion that features in the economy where we're merely paying for food in the United States. It's far greater than $3.2 trillion. And unless we are prepared to break the power of monopolies, we're going to have a system in which agrobiodiversity is compromised in terms of profit, or sacrificed it for profit, and profit for the few. So what are we going to do about it? Well, the good news here is that there are ways of breaking these lock-ins. We can talk about moving public support towards diversified agroecological systems. We can talk about different kinds of supply chains, not the just-in-time kind, but shorter and more resilient kinds that owe a great deal to local agroecologies and local economies. And we can spur those on by buying locally in our public procurement for schools, for hospitals, and for public goods. But the hard part is here. We need to strengthen movements, because the food, the industrial agricultural economy has a movement, and it is a large movement of highly paid lobbyists. I mean, here in the United States, for every elected representative, there are 20 lobbyists from the food industry. We need to develop that for agrobiodiversity so that we can mainstream agroecology and holistic food systems thinking, and develop food planning processes that do join up the benefits of living on a planet that continues to survive, with carbon sequestration, with healthcare. And we'll need new indicators to look at that, so not just the almighty dollar, but new and dynamic sets of indicators. And all of this means that we have to tackle the concentration of power right at the heart of the food system. And that means organizing. That means politics. That means embracing the recognition that agroecology is not just a set of practices and not just great science of the kind that you'll be hearing much more about at this conference, but also a movements involving farmers. And luckily around the world, farmers are already part of this movement. There are 8 million farmer organizations around the world involved in things like agroecology. La Via Campesina, the international peasant movement, has 250 million members around the world. And if you join those movements up with movements of communities that are fighting climate change, that are fighting for their survival under late-stage capitalism, that's the majority of people in the world. And all we need to do is unite. And that's the task ahead of us. So if we are interested in a thriving world of agrobiodiversity, then we're going to have to recognize and get involved in politics more than perhaps we would be inclined to. But let's share that inclination and share our trepidation at stepping into the political arena. But let's hold each other's hands and do it together, because as I thank the many people who made this presentation possible, I know that we cannot undertake this work alone. We will only be able to do it together. But for that, and for you, I'm very